Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the early days of the FBI.
The G-Men, huh?
Yeah. You know how this organization went from basically a bunch of paper pushers to, like, this legendary crime-fighting force?
Yeah, it's a pretty wild story.
So we're basing this deep dive on an episode of the American History Hit podcast. They talked with John Aller, who wrote the book Gangster Hunters.
Great book. Really captured that era. It's amazing to think that the early Bureau of Investigation, the FBI's precursor, was mostly concerned with white-collar crimes.
White-collar crimes? Like what?
Oh, bank fraud, antitrust violations, basically a lot of paperwork.
So not exactly the high-octane stuff you see in the movies.
Not at all. They were a far cry from the FBI we know today.
But then everything changed, right? The 1930s hit, and America was suddenly dealing with this, like, explosion of gangster activity.
Exactly. Guys like Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Machine Gun Kelly, these weren't just criminals, they were almost folk heroes.
Dillinger, especially. I mean, he was constantly in the headlines, escaping from jails, robbing banks.
Well, Dillinger was a master at self-promotion. He knew how to play the media. One time, he even stole a sheriff's car during an escape.
It's almost hard to believe. So how did the Bureau adapt to this new reality? They were used to suits and ties, not Tommy guns and high-speed chases.
They had to adapt quickly or they'd become completely irrelevant. And this is where we start to see the emergence of, like, the G-Man archetype.
I've always wondered about that term. Where did G-Man even come from?
Well, initially it was just a slang term for any government agent. But during this period, it became almost exclusively associated with FBI agents.
So it became a badge of honor in a way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's this story, maybe it's true, maybe not, about Machine Gun Kelly shouting, "Don't shoot, G-Men," when they finally caught him.
Wow, it kind of shows you how quickly the perception shifted.
It does. The G-Men were becoming the new symbols of law and order.
And of course, you can't talk about the FBI's transformation without talking about J. Edgar Hoover.
Right, Hoover. He was obsessed with building the FBI's reputation, and he had a very specific vision for his G-Men.
Like what?
He wanted them to be young, clean-cut, incorruptible. They were supposed to be the antithesis of the corrupt local cops that were so common back then.
So they were like knights in shining armor almost, fighting crime and upholding justice.
Exactly. And no criminal challenged that image more than John Dillinger. He was constantly outsmarting the Bureau, making them look foolish.
Dillinger was public enemy number one, right?
Oh, absolutely. And his exploits put enormous pressure on the FBI. But the tide turned at the Biograph Theater.
The Biograph Theater, that's where they finally got Dillinger, right?
It was a huge turning point.
Yeah.
The FBI staked out the theater, waited for Dillinger to come out, and then, well, let's just say it didn't end well for Dillinger.
It was a media sensation. That event really cemented the FBI's reputation, didn't it?
Totally. After the Biograph Theater, the public saw the G-Men as, like, these unstoppable heroes.
But even with their newfound fame, they still faced a lot of limitations, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. One of the biggest was their lack of jurisdiction over certain crimes. You might be surprised to learn that kidnapping wasn't a federal crime until 1934. Neither was murder.
Wait, really? So even though they were taking down these notorious gangsters, their hands were tied in a lot of ways.
It seems crazy now, but that was the reality back then. The power balance between state and federal law enforcement was very different.
It took some pretty high-profile cases to force change, right? Like the Lindbergh baby kidnapping.
Oh, man, that case absolutely horrified the nation. It became a huge turning point, leading to the passage of the Lindbergh Law, which finally gave the FBI the power to investigate kidnappings.
It's tragic that it took such a horrific event, but it did ultimately expand the FBI's reach.
For sure. And that expansion really gained momentum with FDR's New Deal.
The New Deal.
Yeah. Roosevelt was all about federalizing law enforcement, and that really benefited the FBI.
So we've got the G-Men, newly empowered, they're taking down gangsters. But how did they actually find these guys? I mean, these criminals were always on the move.
Well, they realized they had to adapt. They couldn't just sit in their offices and wait for the phone to ring. They had to play the gangsters game. Meaning they needed to tap into the same networks that gangsters relied on. Informants.
Oh, yeah. Makes sense. These guys needed help, hideouts, information.
Right. And the FBI realized they could turn those, providing that help, they could flip them.
And it worked.
Big time. Informants, often women connected to the outlaws, played a huge role in some of the biggest captures.
That's wild. So the FBI was doing, like, detective work.
Absolutely. They were gathering intel, piecing together clues, working their sources.
And as they were doing that, public opinion started to shift, right? I mean, people were initially kind of fascinated by these gangsters.
Oh, yeah, there was a certain romanticism surrounding them, especially Dillinger. He was seen as like a Robin Hood figure sticking to the banks.
But
then, as the G-men started racking up these big wins, that perception began to change. People started to see the gangsters for what they really were, ruthless criminals.
And the G-men became the heroes.
They became the symbols of law and order. It was a real shift in the American psyche.
It even impacted Hollywood, right?
Oh, yeah. Think about it. James Cagney started out playing gangsters in the movies.
Public Enemy #1. I love that movie.
A classic. But then in 1935, he starred in a film called G-Men.
And he was playing an FBI agent.
Exactly. And the film was a huge hit. It just goes to show you how much things had changed. The G-Man was now the good guy, the hero.
Such a fascinating shift. And of course, Hoover was behind it all. I mean, he was really shaping the FBI's image, right?
Oh, Hoover was a master manipulator. He knew how to control the narrative. And one of his biggest moves was insisting on his agents' anonymity.
Anonymity. But why?
Well, on the surface, it was for their protection. But it also allowed Hoover to maintain control. By keeping his agents out of the spotlight, he made sure that the FBI, and by extension himself, remained the center of attention.
He was a control freak.
Let's just say he liked things done his way. And not everyone was happy about it. Take Melvin Purvis, for example.
Purvis, the guy who brought down Dillinger.
The one and only. Purvis actually became pretty famous after the Dillinger takedown. He was in the news, giving interviews. He was a bit of a media darling, which Hoover hated.
Hoover was jealous.
Hoover couldn't stand sharing the spotlight. He saw Purvis's fame as a threat, and eventually he forced him out of the bureau.
Wow. That's harsh. So this anonymity thing, it really shaped the FBI's image.
It helped to create this mystique, this aura of invincibility. But of course, all that focus on gangsters couldn't last forever. World War II was just around the corner.
And everything changed again, right?
The world was entering a new era of conflict, and the FBI had to adapt to face a new kind of enemy.
Nazi spies.
Exactly. The threat of sabotage, of espionage, it was a whole new ballgame. And the FBI, still a relatively young agency, had to learn fast.
From gangsters to spies, it sounds like the FBI was constantly evolving.
They had to. The world was changing around them, and the threats were becoming more complex.
And then, of course, World War II ended, and we entered the Cold War.
Another huge shift. And for Hoover, with his, intense anti-communist views, this was like his moment.
He saw communists everywhere, right?
Pretty much. And he used the FBI to go after anyone he suspected of communist sympathies.
Activists, artists, intellectuals. It was a pretty dark period.
It was. The FBI was involved in surveillance, blacklisting, all sorts of things that would be considered highly controversial today.
It's hard to believe that this was happening in America.
It's a reminder that even organizations dedicated to upholding the law can sometimes, go too far, especially when they're driven by ideology.
And then the 1960s hit. Civil rights, anti-war protests, the counterculture movement.
Another period of huge social upheaval. And Hoover, well, he saw all of that as a threat to the established order.
So instead of fighting criminals or spies, the FBI was now targeting activists and protesters.
Kind of ironic, isn't it? The agency that was supposed to be the champion of law and order was now being accused of suppressing dissent and violating people's rights.
They were infiltrating groups, wiretapping activists, using informants to sow discord.
Yeah. Those tactics were highly controversial, and they've had a lasting impact on the FBI's reputation.
I mean, targeting groups like the Black Panthers, surveilling Martin Luther King Jr., that's some pretty heavy stuff.
It was a dark chapter, for sure. And it shows how easily an organization, even one with good intentions, can be corrupted by power and ideology.
So, from gangsters to spies to activists, the FBI's history is full of twists and turns.
It's a reflection of America itself, really, constantly changing, evolving, grappling with new challenges.
And as we move into the late 20th century, those challenges just kept coming. The rise of terrorism, the fall of the Soviet Union, the internet.
The internet especially changed everything. Suddenly you had criminals operating across borders, committing crimes in cyberspace.
A whole new world for the FBI to navigate.
Exactly. They had to adapt, to develop new tools and techniques to fight crime in the digital age.
It's amazing to think how much the FBI has changed over the years. Looking back, what do you think is the most important takeaway from all of this?
I think it's the constant tension between security and liberty. It's something the FBI has had to grapple with from the very beginning. How do you protect the nation from threats without infringing on individual rights? It's a question that's still relevant today.
It's a tough question, no easy answers.
It is. And I think it's something we all need to think about. How do we as a society find that balance? How do we ensure our safety without sacrificing our freedom? It's a debate that's going to continue, and it's one that the FBI will always be at the center of.
Some heavy stuff to think about. Well, that's our deep dive into the history of the FBI. From those early days as a white-collar crime unit to the global agency it is today, it's been quite a journey. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was a fascinating conversation.